I greet you, ladies and gentlemen, as I present part 2 of this lecture on the main segments of literature review. The other lectures that I gave in the past, but this year on literature review, are found on the pinned section of the comments, in the pinned comment section under this video. So without wasting a lot of time, I'll go to my PowerPoint presentation. I concluded the last video by looking at the conceptual framework, and I passed slide number 7, but I've got a strong feeling that for us to make sense of whatever I want to cover, and for us to be able to tie in concepts properly, I have to go back a bit and review what I had covered. When we are looking at the conceptual framework demonstrates clearly what you expect to find through your research or study. The conceptual framework is a written or a visual representation of an expected relationship between variables, the variables that have been specified in the study. When we are talking about variables, variables are simply the characteristics, qualities, or properties of certain concepts, the main concepts that are captured by the research topic or the main research objective that one has set out to study or that one wants to actually study. The conceptual framework is generally developed based on a review of the existing literature, that is, existing studies and theories about the topic. The relevant variables for your study must be clearly defined for you to come up with a meaningful conceptual framework. When we are looking at the conceptual framework, we go beyond mere definitions or simple definitions by mapping out how the main variables or concepts of the study might relate to each other. The construction of a conceptual framework precedes data collection, data gathering, or fieldwork. In other words, what we are saying in that point is that it doesn't make any academic sense for a researcher to go and gather or collect data or to undertake fieldwork without a conceptual framework. A conceptual framework is the lens through which you are actually gathering data. You'll be having concepts whose relationships you want to test. The conceptual framework is often represented through a visual format or through visual means such as graphs, flowcharts, or diagrams, with the relationships either shown by arrows or nodes or other symbols. So arrows, nodes, or other symbols, they normally illustrate relationships. When we are looking at the conceptual framework, assuming an experimental research design, we are able to see the variable which is causing the other variable to change, the cause and the effect. So a conceptual framework can be designed in many different ways. The form which your own conceptual framework will take or assume will depend on the relationships that you expect to find or to derive among variables. When we are looking at the conceptual framework, it's important to isolate two sets of variables. On the one hand, we have got what are known as independent variables. On the other hand, we have got what are known as dependent variables. In the language of statistics, mathematics, and econometrics, independent variables are called explanatory variables, and dependent variables are called explained variables. In the language of econometrics or statistical studies, independent variables are called regressors, and then the dependent variables are called regressors. Independent variables are regressors, and dependent variables are called regressors. That's the language of regression analysis, which is a component or a branch of econometrics. The expected cause, which in our example from the previous exposition or from the previous video, is the interest rate, which may be the commercial bank prime lending rate. The commercial bank prime lending rates are expected to be the independent variable, which is also known as a predictor or explanatory variable, as I've already noted. The expected effect, which is changes in cross-fixed capital formation or cross-investment, is the dependent variable, also known as the response or outcome variable. So these variables have got many names. In other words, cross-investment depends on interest rates. And our hypothesis may be stated as follows: that the lower the interest rate, the higher the level of gross investment that is expected in an economy, and vice versa, all other things being equal or constant, which is represented by that ceteris paribus assumption. When we are looking at causal relationships, in practice, they may involve a number of independent variables. In our model, which is looking at the impact of interest rates on cross-fixed capital formation or investment, we may have other explanatory variables such as the inflation rate, the economic growth rate, the index of manufacturing, monthly rainfall figures, statistics, temperatures, and so on, that affect the dependent variable or the outcome variable or the response variable. To keep things simple, we'll work with just one independent variable, namely the interest rate. We'll just work with the interest rate to simplify whatever we're covering in this chapter. So if we are to visualize our expected cause and effect relationship, we can just use two boxes and an arrow in between them, where the box on the left-hand side, that is the first box, stands for the interest rate, which is the cause, and the box on the right-hand side, which is the box of the effect, the cross investment, will be shown with an arrow to it, implying that interest rates cause changes in the cross investment or cross fixed capital formation. The next step may involve the identification of other types of variables that might influence the relationship between our interest rates and cross investment, that is, between our independent and dependent variables. Such variables are normally called moderators, mediators, and control variables. These are different kinds of variables. The question is, what is a moderator? A moderator alters the effect that an independent variable has on a dependent variable. But when we are looking at the moderator, it is not an independent variable. It's just a variable in between the independent variable and the dependent variable, which sort of magnifies the impact or moderates or absorbs the impact of the independent variable on the dependent variable. A complete conceptual framework must include all relevant mediating variables, and these are normally ascertained from the empirical literature. In a causal relationship, that is a cause and effect relationship, a mediating variable is a variable that links the independent and dependent variables, thus allowing the relationship between them to be better explained or amplified. To effectively test a causal relationship between the interest rates and gross investment, one also needs to consider other variables that one might not be interested in measuring the effects of, but that could potentially impact gross investment. These variables are called control variables. They are called control variables. Control variables are variables that are held constant so that they don't interfere with the results or with the effects that are caused by the independent variable on the dependent variable. Such variables may include, in our simple example, economic growth, the savings rate, the balance of trade, long-term or short-term capital flows, the consumer price index, climatological factors, political factors, religious factors such as Islamic finance, for instance, and so on. Now, when we are looking at mediating variables, in a cause and effect relationship, a mediating variable, as I explained earlier on, is a variable that links the independent and dependent variables, allowing the relationship between them to be explained better. So when you say interest rates have a negative effect on, changes in interest rates have a negative impact on gross investment, without talking about the transmission, the variable in the transmission mechanism, which is the consumer price index, one will be presenting an incomplete picture of what is going on. So on slide number 13, the mediating variable, which is the consumer price index, we assume it's the consumer price index. It's now included such that our interest rates are affecting the dependent variable gross investment via the consumer price index. And then the mediating variable must not be confused with the moderator variable. It's imperative not to confuse a moderator and a mediator. To remember the difference, you can think of them in relation to the independent variable. A mediating variable is affected by the independent variable, and it affects the dependent variable. So it's an intermediate cause, so to speak. Therefore, it links the two variables and helps explain the relationship between them. A moderating variable is not affected by the independent variable. It's independent from the independent variable, even though it affects the dependent variable. So we can see this from the next slide. In the next slide, we have got an independent variable, which is interest rate. And then we have got a moderator variable, which is money supply. All of these variables have got an impact on the behavior of gross investment. Now, when we are looking at control variables, these are variables which are exogenous to the model, or which usually can be mentioned in passing, but they are not an integral part of the formulated model. Such variables may include economic growth, macroeconomic policy issues, so on. Economic growth has got a definite impact on gross investment, according to the prediction of the Solo model of economic growth. But what we set out to investigate is not that. It's not the relationship between economic growth and gross investment, but rather it's the relationship between our independent variable, which is interest rates, and our dependent variable, which is gross investment. As you can see from slide number 16, our control variable, economic growth, is independent from our independent variable, which is interest rates. But they work jointly, so to speak, in affecting the dependent variable, which is gross investment. When you are looking at a control variable, it must be held constant at all times during the modeling process, during the experimentation process. We know that in economics, it's virtually impossible to hold any real wealth factor constant. So we use the ceteris paribus assumption in order to assume that certain factors are constant. For instance, when we look at the so-called law of demand, it postulates that when the price increases, the quantity demanded reduces. In other words, there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. But we know there are other factors like prices of other commodities, levels of income, the consumer price index, macroeconomic policy issues, and so on. We just control for them by assuming they are constant. In other words, we'll be lumping them under the error term, since they won't be explicitly stated or specified. When we are looking at the theoretical literature review, in its most basic form, a theory either predicts or explains a phenomenon. Theories are constructed by the human mind to understand our surrounding environment and can be quite complex. So there are simple theories and complex theories. The purpose of this section is to present logical or relevant and important theories that link with the research topic. So all theories that link with the research topic, important ones, I mean to say, must be clearly articulated under this section 2.3. It is always advisable to start from a simple theory to more complex theories. Logic plays a role in developing the theoretical framework of a study. The purpose of this form of literature, I'm going to add the omission of this form, but it's the form of literature, is to concretely examine the corpus of theory that has accumulated in regard to an issue, concept, theory, or phenomenon. Corpus refers to a collection of written texts, especially the entire works of a particular author or a body of writing on a particular subject. Now, when we are looking at the theoretical literature review, we know that it helps us to establish what theories exist and the relationships among variables or between variables, and the extent to which the existing theories have been investigated and to develop new hypotheses to be tested. When we are looking at this type of literature review, it can assist us to establish whether appropriate theories are actually lacking or whether current theories are inadequate for explaining new and emerging research trends or research problems. The unit of analysis can focus on a theoretical concept or a whole theory or framework. Now, as an example, when you are looking at the investment, this investment variable that I've been giving an example of, you can use neoclassical theory or other types of theories. Now, you would know that there is also the accelerator principle and also Topin's Q theory of investment. When we are looking at all of these theories, they assume optimization behavior on behalf of the decision maker who is the investor. The neoclassical and Topin's theory of investment explicitly assumes profit or shareholder value maximization or value maximization. The accelerator theory of investment assumes this explicitly by assuming that investment is determined by an optimal capital stock. The accelerator approach is often associated with a Keynesian school of thought, which is primarily due to its assumption of fixed prices. You know, in the neoclassical theory, they don't assume that prices are fixed. The accelerator principle theory was first suggested by Clark in 1917 and is well known for its applications by Samuelson. I will correct the spelling of Paul Samuelson. And to cycles, business cycles. The accelerator is in fact merely a special case of the neoclassical theory of investment, where the price variables have been reduced to constant. So if you reduce the price variables to constant, you, in the neoclassical theory, you get to the accelerator theory of investment. So how about empirical literature review? Because we can't just end with the theoretical framework or theoretical literature review. We have to test the theories or the variables that we were able to observe or that we were able to gather from the extant literature. We must test their relationships or check rather how existing scholars have actually tested relationships between variables. So when we are looking at empirical literature review, its working definition is that it is that type of literature review or that segment of literature review in which theories, concepts, or models are tested using gathered data, evidence, or facts. Thus, empirical evidence is neither theory alone nor data alone. A theory, concept, or model is a necessary condition for empirical evidence. However, gathered data used to test the theory, concept, or model constitute the sufficient condition of empirical evidence. So what is not in the empirical literature? How can we see that whatever a person has written is not in empirical literature review? It must be obvious by now that that literature review based on evidence that is not developed in a systematic, objective, and transparent manner is not empirical literature. So if someone has got evidence and they use it to write a subjective newspaper article, one cannot claim that they are actually reviewing empirical evidence or they are doing empirical literature review, because in a newspaper article, sometimes academic concepts are not handled in a systematic, objective, and transparent manner. On one hand, non-empirical types of professional literature may have great significance to economists. For instance, economics or finance scholars may produce articles that are clearly identified as describing a new intervention or program in the community or country without any due regard or evaluation of evidence or a critiquing of a policy or practice or offering a tentative and tested theory about a phenomenon. Now we have got a checklist of things or sources of information that don't really constitute empirical literature, except for people who are doing social psychology or people who are doing political science, and so on. They can rely on newspapers and magazines, but in the field of banking and finance, we don't expect a student or a researcher to use their course instructors or professors or lecturers unpublished lectures or lecture notes as a source of empirical evidence, because such notes wouldn't have been critiqued by other scholars in the field under normal circumstances. The second point, political statements. If a political statement is made that there are now 20 billion people in Zimbabwe, if you are a serious researcher, you can't cite such information which was spoken in a rush, that people in Zimbabwe are now 20 million. You need, a write-up which is systematic, objective, and transparent in manner to constitute your literature review. Newspapers or magazines, which represent journalism and might be used in journalism as empirical evidence. In commerce, we don't expect anyone to rely heavily on newspapers or magazines to come up with the conceptual framework or to come up with empirical literature review, as well as other forms of media like websites, TikTok, videos, Facebook postings, Twitter tweets, and blog postings. All of these, they might provide useful information to a political scientist or someone who is scouting certain markets, but definitely they are not very useful to the review of the empirical literature. The introductory literature review in an empirical article may not constitute empirical literature review, because there will be no theory which is juxtaposed with the practical real-world situation. In textbooks, whatever is written in textbooks sometimes can be highly opinionated. So textbooks can't be held to be sources of empirical evidence, except if they provide factual information and they're quite analytical, and they analyze just like research papers. It's very imperative when one is conducting empirical literature review to ensure that textbook information is only included when that textbook information is very rigorous and not biased or based on the views of one person. The point which I made earlier on is that even if the writer of the textbook or the author of the textbook is analyzing the same way as journals are analyzing, but because the review process may not be the blind peer review process, it becomes imperative for one to treat such evidence with a pinch of salt, because you might be citing empirical evidence, facts or figures, or even arguments which were never reviewed by anyone except the content editor, who most probably would have been just checking the language. Now, when you are done with empirical evidence, which may take the case study approach or the thematic approach, as I noted in one of the videos that I've already done. Once you are done with your empirical literature review, you move on to focused literature review. Focused literature review is part of empirical evidence. But the reason why I am calling it focused literature review is because this is a section. This section is usually applicable to case study-based research topics. Such research topics may include, but are not limited to, the impact of interest rates on gross investment in the case of Zimbabwe, effects of dollarization on bank profitability, the case of FBC and CPZ banks. So the last part of your literature review chapter, ladies and gentlemen, where I am going to conclude for tonight, is the chapter summary or conclusion. This section summarizes the whole chapter, mentioning all the key issues that would have been discussed. But the section does not introduce any new concepts or rediscuss issues that have been tackled under literature review proper. This part of the literature review concludes on already presented and discussed material. The section is brief and is expected to be precise. It is normally one compact, brief, and precise paragraph. The last statement of this section typically captures what the next chapter consists of. The language used to do so is present tense. It is wrong for a person who is compiling their chapter 2 to say, the next chapter, chapter 3, research methodology, will explain how the study was conducted. That's wrong language. Because chapter 2 and chapter 3 are in the same, under normal circumstances, when a final draft has been prepared. We expect chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, plus appendices and preliminary pages. We expect all of them to be in one document. So there is no justification for using future tense. So we are done with our presentation of the main segments of literature review. As you can see, I didn't cover everything exhaustively because I'm just giving you a framework. And then in our next lecture, what we are going to do, I'm going to look at what I consider to be a satisfactory literature review chapter and what I consider to be a more or less thoroughly done literature review chapter. And then we learn through that. That's what we're going to do in tomorrow's lecture. Have a pleasant evening. I appreciate your time.